Always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein has been the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights since 2014. In those 4 years, the attacks on people's safety and dignity seem to have reached into all corners of the world. Myanmar's campaign to drive hundreds of thousands of ethnic Rohingya out of the country. The abuse and denial of asylum heaped on migrants fleeing war and economic deprivation. The carnage left behind in the civil wars in Yemen and in Syria, as well as in those parts of Syria and Iraq once controlled by ISIL. One would think Zeid's calls on countries to do better would have been welcomed, but the High Commissioner has been criticized for pointing out where countries have failed to preserve human rights. We discuss why human rights are under more pressure than ever and what should be done to protect them when Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein talks to Al Jazeera. Thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much.
We're coming up on the end of your tenure, and I wanted to ask you first, just to get this out of the way. You didn't ask for a second term. You didn't think you would get the backing of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. And the thinking is, al-Hussein is just too vocal. Zeid speaks his mind too much. He's not diplomatic enough. Why not get the P5 on the record and say, we needed someone who wasn't going to be so forward-leaning on trying to get the world to respect human rights?
It's a good question. I never really assumed when I took this job that I would need to supplicate or need to prostrate myself before governments, because the office itself, yes, it's a part of the UN, but it's also part of a broader human rights movement. And the job of High Commissioner is to be effectively the ambassador of human rights. Well, what does that mean? It means that you have human rights law and you have obligations upon states to abide by the law. And where they don't do so, you have to then defend the victims who either are deprived of their rights or they're discriminated against when it comes to their rights, or they live in fear. And so my job was not to defend governments, they can do that themselves. My job was to defend, and together with my office, of which I'm very proud, to defend the rights of everyone else, individuals. And in that sense, I knew early on that I'm not going to have the backing of the permanent members of the Security Council. In actual fact, I would be concerned if I was on the outside and I saw that a High Commissioner had won support of the P5, because I would suspect that they haven't done their job properly. It almost goes without saying that the permanent 5 enjoy a privileged status here in New York by dint of the use of veto in the Security Council. In Geneva, they don't. They're just one of 47 members on the Human Rights Council, if they're serving on the Human Rights Council. And we in the human rights community look at their records in the same way we look at anyone else's records. And the assumption, it's not just an assumption, they don't like that. So I knew it wasn't going to be possible.
You raised eyebrows when you spoke at the refugees conference here a couple of years ago, and you said, we're here because we as a global community have failed.
Yes.
People are so desperate that they're getting into rickety ships and paying thousands of sums to people who don't have their best welfare at heart.
Yes.
And we're here because we haven't found the will to stop that from happening.
Yes.
Is that your biggest regret?
No, it's an acknowledgement of failure, and that's why we have these compacts. If we were doing everything correctly, there's no need for everyone to gather and meet and discuss. I mean, it has to be placed into perspective, this. The number of peoples on the move globally sort of is in the range of about maybe 4.5%. So 95% and above of people on this planet are static. I mean, they stay within their countries, right? So all this hysteria that we see, this panic, the trending toward the more extreme demagoguery is as a result of the small percentage of people who are actually moving across the planet.
Where does that xenophobia come from? We
Well,
see it here in the US, we see it in Central
Yeah.
Europe, we see it in parts of Southern Europe, we see it in some parts of India. Where does that come from?
Well, it comes from a recognition by politicians that the tactic works. Whatever the ills in society, whatever the miscues by previous governments, the inability of previous governments, or indeed present governments, to cope with current circumstances, well, then I pinpoint the blame on a particular community that seems different, that seems alien, that is vying for jobs, and you turn the hatred on them. This is an old device. The sad part of it is that it works, and people tend to, out of fear, adhere to it, and the politicians know it. But there is a cautionary note, is that the cautionary tale to this, and that is that the logical extension of it is a sour outcome. If you get chauvinistic nationalism, a bigotry, a sort of racist undercurrent moving, and it reaches a certain pitch, traditionally, when we look at the historical record, it's not easy to suddenly dismantle it. Mm-hmm. And what you tend to find is that conflict arises out of it. Because suddenly you're telling a people that they're no longer special, mm-hmm. that they no longer somehow are superior to others, that we're all endowed with the same rights, that we all have those rights and need to be treated equally, whether on the basis of gender, ethnicity, whatever the circumstances may be.
Your thoughts on Michelle Bachelet coming in as your successor?
Well, I'm fortunate enough to know her personally, mm-hmm. and I count her as a friend. We worked together when she was head of UN Women, and I couldn't be more delighted. I think she has proven her credentials both as a leader within the UN and as a head of state of her own country, and someone who in early part of her life was subject to coercive practices and torture. You have a political leader of great substance and a real strong will. So I couldn't be delighted, and I'd be looking forward to the transition from me to her.
When we discuss North Korea or DPRK, it's all about Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions. There seems to be absolutely no public discussion or urgency about its appalling human rights record. What pressure can you bring in your final weeks on the job to remind people this isn't about just North Korea's military, but the millions of people who have suffered under three leaders?
Yeah, I would dispute that it's been forgotten. I mean, perhaps in the context of the immediate discussions mm-hmm. that would seem to be taking place, it's not being mentioned. But I don't think it's easy for anyone to forget, given the severity of the human rights violations detailed in the Kirby Commission's report, but mm-hmm. also by our office, and that work is continuing and ongoing. There is a fear, though, that if the negotiations were to mature, that somehow these issues would be downgraded. And that's a fear we have with respect to many conflicts that begin to wind down. Mm-hmm. And during the conflict, there's a strong call for accountability, that the perpetrators would be punished. And as we work our way through the peace agreements, and then people say, not now, we leave it till a few years when it's cooled down a bit. What we find, though, is that later it becomes even more difficult. Mm-hmm. And you cannot. The victims need to feel that they're at the center of these negotiations, that their pain is being attenuated. And if you don't do that, then it becomes problematic. So we'll watch the DPRK file closely. I'm sure my successor will. And if we see that it's basically being pushed off the table, certainly we're going to be speaking about it, and we speak about it quite regularly.
Do you fear that even though he has the legal right to do so, that Kim Jong-un could be addressing the General Assembly in September?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that I don't know. I mean, you've asked me a question, and I haven't really given much thought about it. I mean, the position.
But does it create the wrong impression that he's been welcomed back into the international community?
I mean, clearly it would raise a lot of eyebrows. And I mean, the position of the UN, as I understand it, is that if you're indicted by an international court for the atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against, the crime of genocide, then it would really be impermissible for you to turn up in New York. But if there hasn't been a charge like that, the evidence is still being collected, although there's very strong indications that the most severe human rights conditions exist. Certainly there will be a lot of criticism of the UN. And I, as High Commissioner or an ex-High Commissioner, wouldn't feel comfortable with it. Yeah.
When you talk about technicalities, that's certainly been the case in recent developments in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. JeanPierre Bemba, out of prison, filed his papers to run for president. He was convicted of war crimes in the Central African Republic. What happened here? How did we get to this point?
Well, I haven't read the judgment of the appellate judgment of the ICC. So in one way, I don't want to go into it because I need to read the judgment and then understand. And certainly there were those within the international criminal law community who had their own feelings about the decision. But I would need to read it myself and then form an opinion. So it would be premature for me to say anything about it. But you can understand, of course, the communities in the CAR, but not maybe limited there, even within the DRC, who would see it as an odd decision by the appellate body. On the other hand, throughout legal systems in the world, across the world, we have decisions by courts that often arouse reactions, strong reactions. It's not to say the system has failed, but the system gives an interpretation which could seem to be at odds with the jurisprudence that was generated hitherto. I need to look at the actual details before commenting on that.
But isn't this the case that we're not talking about a sovereign government's justice system? We're talking about something that was set up and agreed to by the international community, and that all of the talk when he was convicted a decade ago of its validity, of it acquiring a real sense of dealing with these sorts of atrocities may now have been undermined.
Well,
or is that a risk
if this is an aberration, if this is an aberrant decision, it will reset itself, and we've seen this before in terms of other decisions taken by international courts or tribunals. The question is it an aberration or not? And I have to read the decision, clearly the judges felt that they had come up with a decision which they felt warranted the acquittal of JeanPierre Bemba. And I do need to see the decision before commenting, though. It would be really improper for me to say something and then and you'll ask me another question and I'll say, really, I don't know what they actually said in terms of the reasoning put forward. So I do need to see that.
Syria.
Yes.
There seems to be a growing consensus that Bashar al-Assad is winning the war. Has he gotten away with war crimes?
Well, at the moment we have an accountability mechanism. It's collating evidence. It's continuing to collect evidence. The evidence has also been directed toward it from the Commission of Inquiry. That's still operating. One would believe that there would be a strong push for accountability, for truth-telling, that too many victims, too many people have suffered in this cruel war to just let it pass, to have it somehow forgotten. And I would believe that there will be a time of reckoning for the president, for his senior leadership, and for others who are thought to have committed the most ghastly crimes in Syria.
Where does that reckoning happen?
Well,
At the Security Council?
Well, no, it's a reckoning before the victims, before a court.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we saw at the end of last year a number of things happen where those who had perpetrated crimes many years ago must have thought they got away with it.
Mm-hmm.
And for a while they did, but then in the end, Ratko Mladic was convicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
Mm-hmm.
There were two former Argentine officers who were convicted for their role in the dirty war, the so-called dirty war, many years ago. There was a Salvadorian colonel who was extradited from the US to Spain to face potentially charges on account of an alleged involvement with the killing of Jesuit priests in El Salvador in 1989. Mm-hmm. In other words, they're activists, lawyers, journalists, the world over who are collecting evidence, preparing evidence, and people who have been complicit in the commission of war crimes. And certainly if they were the sort of intellectual author, may at some stage feel comfortable that they've got away with it and that they had been doing in any case something they believed was heroic and patriotic. And perhaps it began to dawn on them later that maybe not so, that maybe these are crimes against humanity and war crimes. And then time caught up with them. So, you know, yes, there's a thirst, a demand, a need by certainly victims groups to see someone who they believe has created so much suffering, you know, held to account in a court of law. But it sometimes takes longer and sometimes painfully long time to get there. But eventually I would hope in a context like Syria that there will be justice for the victims. Yes.
Israel-Palestine, the passage of the nation-state law in Jerusalem. Is it understandable? Is it problematic?
No, I said before and publicly, it's clear that it's discriminatory. Mm-hmm. And I don't see how else you could package an argument which makes sense to the, let's say, to any objective observation of all of this. Mm-hmm. And that's how we see it as an office. It seems to be a discriminatory law.
So what happens if you're an Israeli and you're not also Jewish?
Well,
are you now a second-class citizen?
Well, I mean, obviously you feel that the law would be discriminating against you. And it's clear, I mean, there's been a reaction by various leaders of the Druze community, mm-hmm. and the Arab-Israeli community, of course, has made its views known as well. No, and it's, you know, in human rights terms, again, to achieve any sort of stability, tranquility, mm-hmm. 3 conditions need to obtain. One is that you don't discriminate against people in your own country on the basis of race, ethnicity, color, gender, and so forth. 2, that you don't deprive parts of your community subject to those discriminations from the largesse of the state, and keep them without protections, social protections. 3, that you don't have people live in fear in your country. And you have to remove that sense of fear and instill within them a respect for institutions, a trust in institutions, where basically they feel they'll be treated fairly. And if they feel they'll be treated fairly, then there's little basis for then maintaining a sort of fearful state. And so when you don't do those things, then of course you create tensions within society and fear that it's played on.
Not everyone is sad to see you go.
No, I'm sure a lot are happy.
No, the Israeli ambassador Danny Danon sent out a statement saying this, and I quote, "During his tenure, the HRC became a theater of the absurd, the Human Rights Council, with hypocrisy and double standards rampant among its proceedings and reports."
Well, look, the ambassador, I don't know the ambassador, to be honest. I mean, he's never come to Geneva. I find it sort of quite strange that he talks of human rights when I assume that he knows very little about it. I'm not the president of the Human Rights Council. Mm-hmm. So for one, to sort of conflate the two is nonsense. But he said some other things about me. I mean, I don't take him seriously because, again, he's not a human rights person. I've known many Israeli ambassadors, worked with them, and they seem to be serious about these issues. This ambassador, he's never come to Geneva. We've never discussed these issues, so I don't take much or attach much importance to what he says.
The well-being of women activists in Saudi Arabia, have they been forgotten?
Well, I don't know if they've been forgotten.
Certainly your office has talked about them.
We've talked about
recently.
them, yes, and we are concerned. I mean, any time when you have a number of activists arrested, we worry about whether it be an arbitrary arrest on direction of policy, at the direction of policy. And so I'm sure my office has opened up the channels, and we want to understand what led to this exactly. Why has it flared up? We would naturally want to see their earliest possible release. And certainly if there are no charges, they should be released immediately. And even if there were charges, we need to understand what exactly they're being charged with.
Are there other places around the world that you don't think get enough attention because of how their citizens are faring or are not faring? I've had some people talk about the situation in Nicaragua as one example.
Yeah, I mean, again, if it's whether we in our office are missing things, I tend to think generally we do a good job. I mean, there may be certain things that we don't see immediately, and then we're alerted to by a specific NGO, a specific group that will say, you need to look at this because it's really becoming dangerous, then we will certainly do that. Nicaragua is a country I'm very worried about because as they conduct these sweeps and they're arresting, detaining young activists who were associated with the protests, we need to be assured that these people are not being harmed, and very concerned about the possibility of disappearances, enforced disappearances, and potentially, of course, torture. And all of this we need to understand what is going on. So I'm talking to others. I've been in touch with people in this country. We talk to the Europeans. Need to talk to the OAS and the ICC, but we need to all keep a very close eye on Nicaragua because I very much fear for the stability of the state if the current government's policies are continued and there is no accountability for what we saw it was horrific violence, mainly by state actors and by the paramilitary forces involved.
You're stepping away at a rather contentious moment for the world.
Yeah.
What do you do now?
Yeah, I need to spend time with my family. I have been away from them for 4 years. And so I have to reintroduce myself to them, and a little bit of a rest, and then I'll pick up again, and I'll find something not too distant from the work that I've been doing thus far.
So people have not heard the last of you?
I don't think so. I don't think so. But I may need a rest before I pick it up again.
Who do you see coming behind you? Who's in the next generation of human rights advocates?
When I sit with young people who lead protest movements, who are courageous, who are willing to give everything up, and who are very reasoned, they understand the dangers, they understand what could potentially happen to them, and yet they would still do it. That is real leadership for me, and much more so than many politicians who masquerade as leaders, very concerned about, protocol issues, whether they're the first speaker at a particular conference, whether they're entitled with excellencies and I don't know what. I find many of them are just frauds, really. They're not serious. The serious people are the young human rights defenders who stake everything on account of principle. And I think there is an incredible leadership there, mainly unsung, many of them not really known, but they are there. And they're the hope of humanity, really.
Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, High Commissioner for Human Rights, thanks so much for talking to us on Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much. Thank you.